Okay, good morning. Let's make a start. Thank you all for coming very much. I'd like to just announce the sponsorship, which is for the whole academic year 2022, sponsored very kindly and anonymously, Le'ilu Nishmois Brana Bas Bandit and Zelig Ben Kalman. Please God, it should be an aliyah for their neshamas, and we should learn good Torah. We're certainly going to be learning exciting Torah. Hopefully it'll be correct as well, although we're veering off into areas that are not my expertise at all. I'm not a Kabbalist, but I will try and share with you some of the ideas about Moshiach that we're bringing out today. So let's just recap. Over the last, can I remind you also, phones off please. I reminded me to remind you, if you don't mind turning your phones off and masks on please, so that we can have the right things turned on and the right things off, etc. Okay, fine. 2 weeks ago, this is part 3 of a 4-part series. So let me catch you up because a couple of people weren't here last week. 2 weeks ago, we looked at Maimonides. We're looking at the idea of Moshiach, the Messianic era. 2 weeks ago, we looked at Maimonides and a very rationalist understanding of Moshiach. He's restorative, in the words of Gershom Scholem, in the sense that he sees Moshiach as going back to the days when we had our Torah working fully with the Beis HaMikdash, with Korbanos, with the Kohanim, with Tumantara, etc. It will not, says the Rambam, be a new world in the sense of miraculous. There will be no miracles. It will be a world that runs in the normal way, but there will be a total world change of attitude whereby people will no longer kill each other, steal from each other, compete with each other. They'll invest all the money in medical research, that people could live hundreds of years, but not through miracles, but through the natural course of technology and societal development. And that's the Rambam's view of Mashiach. For the Rambam, Olam Haba is the soul world, which is the world that we go to after death, entirely spiritual. That is the ultimate goal in terms of reward and punishment. Mashiach is an amazing opportunity in this world to gain more mitzvot in an atmosphere which is conducive to learning and mitzvot and get to Olam Haba. And therefore we'll see next week in the final series, the Rambam says, the final part of the series, the Rambam says even when the dead are revived and resurrected, they will also die, because ultimately the goal is Olam Haba, which for him is the spiritual world. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week, we looked at a very different vision of Mashiach, which is the Ramban and the world of the mystics, where we saw that their understanding of Olam Haba and Mashiach is much more integrated. Olam Haba is going to be ultimately a Gan Eden type existence, an Edenic existence where we will, like Adam and Chava before the sin, have removed the Yetzer Hara from our lives. The Yetzer Hara will be shechted. We saw the source last week that God will remove entirely, take outside of us, and therefore our inclinations will only be good and positive like Adam's and Chava's. Of course, it's still a possibility of sin, but it's much more remote, and we will live forever, or at least a very long time. Mashiach may live forever. The world will be completely miraculous, and we won't, and controversially, we won't need the Torah anymore. Certainly not the Torah that we've had up to now, because the Torah that we've had since Har Sinai has been related to a reality of a world that is sinful, where we have Yetzer Haras for this and Yetzer Haras for that, and the Torah has to deal with it. In Yemos HaMashiach, which will be also Olam Haba, all combined, a physical, spiritual matrix, we won't need that Torah anymore. And that's a very controversial statement. For the Rambam, we saw last week, that is heresy. It's a heretical statement, because you are saying that Torah will one day change, and the Rambam's 9th principle is that Torah will never change. But it's consistent with their approaches generally to Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh, whereas the Rambam sees the two as never the twain shall meet. Therefore, a malach cannot have a body. It's purely spiritual. The Ramban and the mystics see that the worlds combine together. One thing that I didn't mention last week, which is fascinatingly, 2 of the mitzvahs which Chazal pick up on that will be reversed in Olam Haba, according to the mystical understanding of like Mashiach Olam Haba, are tray food. The chazir we mentioned last week will come back to being kosher again. And also nida. Nida will be removed. There'll be no more nida. That was a product of the sin, and that won't exist at all. I didn't mention this last week, but there's a fascinating Sforno. The Sforno, at the beginning of chapter 11 of Vayikra, Parsha Shmini, the Sforno lived in Italy in the 1600s, late 1500s, and he makes an interesting point, which is that if you look at the Torah is given in Shemot, the parshas we're reading at the moment, Mishpatim, Truma, Tetzaveh, etc., there is no mention of tray for animals, and there is no mention of nida. There are mentions of basar v'chalav, That's true. And treifa, that an animal can be torn and not kosher. But the idea of there being a kosher animal and a non-kosher animal does not appear in Shemot at all. So too, there are prohibited relationships. Yes, incest is prohibited, but there's no nidah, there's no mention of any of those mitzvahs until Vayikra. Says the Sforno that that's because after the Chet HaEgel, God needed to turn to plan B, if you like. Plan A was Mishpatim, which was Torah version 1. The truth is, plan A was Gan Eden, and plan B was the flood, and plan C was Avram. So we're already on to plan D, F, or E, or F. But if you like, for the Jewish people, Mishpatim was the first idea. That went wrong because the Jewish people messed it up at the Egel. So God says to Moshe, okay, that's the end of that Brit. If you read Kisisa, it says very clearly, the Brit is over. We need to make a new Brit. And the Ramban comes in there as well and says it's a new Torah, a new Brit, and they got the mitzvahs of Vayikra, and of course they messed up again after the Chetem Meraglim, and they need a new Torah, plan 3, which is Devarim, etc. And the Sforno makes that point that these mitzvot, which are introduced in Vayikra, may not have been needed before the Chet HaEgel. And it's fascinating that he picks up on these same two mitzvot, and I'm sure that he's reading that mystical idea that when we roll back the reality to a pre-Egel world, certain mitzvot will fall away. Again, this is anathema for the Rambam. For Maimonides, this is absolutely out of order, but the mystics understand it that way. Now, we left off last time.
Wasn't that exactly the mystical approach taken by Shabbetai Zevi?
Oh, we'll get to that right now.
Okay.
Right now. So we started talking about Shabbetai Zevi. I just want to pick up on that because I didn't want to rush it last week. Gershom Scholem, who is the father of academic analysis of the Kabbalah, the mystical writings of the Jewish people, he himself obviously is not a Kabbalist, probably not, but he was an academic that dealt with Kabbalah. I don't think he was a Kabbalist, but his approach is very linear, and he understands the developments of Kabbalah as tying into Shabbetai Zevi in the following way. He says the early Kabbalah, as developed in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, was not particularly messianic. It was much more involved in understanding the developments and the growth of the individual, connection to God, understanding what is God, how did God create the world. It was much less focused on what will be at the end of days. It certainly wasn't apocalyptic in the sense we're going to get to today. Gershom Scholem then argues that after the exile from Spain, when the Jewish people were thrown into this catastrophe of exile, he understands that the Arizal's development of the halachics, of the Kabbalistic system, which was very prominent, it was a new approach in understanding the Zohar, etc. He understands that the Arizal was affected by the exile very strongly. He himself was not exiled. The Arizal was born in Israel, lived in Egypt, came back to Sfat. But the Jewish world, the exiles in Sfat were the exile of the Gerushay Sfarad. Rav Yosef Karo, these people were very much, had this reality, this post-Holocaust reality with them. And therefore, Scholem understands that the Arizal's Kabbalah was affected by that. What is the Arizal's Kabbalah? So I'm not a Kabbalist, but I'll give you a very brief understanding of what we're talking about so you can tie this in, and your question is very pertinent. In the Kabbalistic worldview of the Arizal, based on the Zohar, originally there was the Ein Sof. And again, what I'm about to tell you is almost certainly not accurate. Please turn to your local Orthodox Kabbalist for proper guidance, okay? Originally there was the Ein Sof. The Ein Sof is God as completely transcendent, unknowable, indescribable, and unconnectable within that sense. What God then did is create a tzimtzum. The tzimtzum was the contraction of that all-pervasive reality of the Ein Sof to create a space in which creation of this world could happen. And there's a very major debate. Was the tzimtzum a real tzimtzum that God actually contracted, or was it only a virtual tzimtzum that from our perspective, it looks like God contracted, but that's a debate I'm not getting into. After this tzimtzum, there was an afterglow of the original Ein Sof, which was left in the space, which is called the Reshimu, which is the kind of afterglow left. And from that was created a system, and almost like an architecture, which is called the Spheros. The Spheros, the Sphirot, is a way that God will be emanating his presence into the world that we live in so that we can connect in some way with God. The Kabbalists, don't forget, see God as being much more immanent, much more connectable with and describable and understandable than the Rambam, who basically says there's nothing you can do to describe God. Yes?
I didn't follow it. Sorry, you said that there was an afterglow.
Yes, and from that afterglow, there was a system, an architecture of these spheres which was created, through which God could then return his presence into the world. Now, if you look briefly on page 4, just turn briefly to page 4. I brought you a very classic diagram of the spheres, okay? And you will be well familiar with these because it's been, you would have seen them in different contexts where you have basically 10. Let's leave aside Da'at, which is a somewhat later addition, so that's why it's in a different color. You've got a structure, almost like an architecture, like I said, of 10 spheres of Keter, Bina, and Chochma and Bina, and Chesed and Gvura, Tiferet in the middle, Netzach and Hod, Yesod between them, and Malchut at the bottom. And they all interconnect and feed into each other, and there are lots of different ways that you can divide them. You can divide them into groups of 3. You can look at the left side, the right side, the middle, etc. And there's an entire literature, obviously, of Kabbalistic insight on that. The Arizal's chidush really was that when God started inserting his light back into this system of spheres, there was a cataclysmic shattering of the spheres. A shvirat hakelim, he calls it. That the first Keter was not affected because it was able to contain the light. Bina and Chochma were pushed in some way to out of kilter, and everything else underneath that was shattered completely. And what you then end up with in this world is a combination of the klipot, which are, if you like, the shells, the structure of what were the kalim that had been created before, connected with the sparks, the nitzotzot of the light that went through them, that was shattered from its intensity, the kalim themselves. And therefore, what you are left with in this world is a combination of the husks of the klipot, which are the forces of negativity, of tum'ah, of evil, and interspersed with them all around us are these nitzotzot, are these sparks of emet, of godly presence. Now, lahavdil, Shabbetai Zevi fed into this. Gershom Scholem's understanding is the Shabbetai Zevi took this Kabbalistic worldview of the Arizal and he took it to the next very dangerous stage, which is, in order to redeem these sparks, we need to immerse ourselves in the negativity of this world to find the sparks which are buried very much deepest in the world in order to redeem them. And where are those sparks? Those sparks are in the Aveira itself. In the actual sin. When you immerse yourself in this sin, you will be able to get in there and find that spark and pull it out. And that's part of this process of tikkun. And therefore, then you have this idea of aveira lishma and aveira l'shem shamayim, which is a concept in the Gemara. But Shabbetai Zevi takes it to a whole new level and says, we are now going to institutionalize aveiras for the sake of heaven in order to redeem these sparks and bring them a tikkun. And therefore, in his own lifetime, they did certain things. They canceled Tisha B'Av, they canceled Yom Kippur, they ate Basar V'Chalav, they ate Chaylev. These things are Chayv Kares, Yom Kippur, Chaylev, etc. And they said, we are doing this l'shem mitzvah to redeem these sparks. And of course, after he died, well, before he died, he converted to Islam. The brief history of Shabbetai Zevi, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on today, is that he arose in the 1660s, extremely strange individual, doing strange things already from his youth. By the 1660s, he became a danger. There was a whole world movement considering him the Messiah. He said he was the Moshiach. Natan Ha'azati, who was his sidekick, said that he was Eliyahu Hanavi and the Moshiach had come. When the Sultan eventually found out that this was a major political problem, he said, you either die or you convert. He converted. And then the Sabbatean movement made from this conversion a whole theology in and of itself, that he needed to convert to get even deeper down into the world of apostasy, of sin, to find those sparks which are the very deepest of them all. And most people realized he was a fraud at this stage, and there was a mass depression, if you like, of the Jewish people following that excitement of this false Messiah being thrust all the way down. But there were some that went underground. The Donmei in Turkey developed a whole Sabbatean theology, the Frankists in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and it became almost nihilistic. They were actually involved in mass sexual impropriety and wife swapping, etc. All the shame finding these sparks, and eventually the Frankists converted to Christianity. And Gershom Scholem's theory, actually, whether this is right or not, is a big academic debate. Is that the growth of Chassidut was an attempt to put the genie back into the bottle and reclaim the Kabbalistic system, remove it from Shabbetai Zevi, and instead of focusing it on the messianic end, focus it inwards on the psychological growth of the individual. Take all those ideas and put them back inside the individual in terms of the tikkun within themselves. And that's Sholem's thesis. And Sholem's further thesis is that many of the anti or post-religious movements in the Jewish world in the 19th century, Reform Judaism, secular world, Haskalah, many of them found in the Sabbatean world a lot of very keen adherents who wanted already to be post-halachic, and this was another opportunity. And he outs all these people like Louis Brandeis, who he said was from a Sabbatean family, and were these leading individuals. I'm not getting into all of that now, but many of Sholem's students have rejected his thesis on different levels. I brought you a long footnote. They said that that's not true. The Arizal was less messianic than you think, and the Sabbateans were even interested in the Arizal, and the Hasidus doesn't work like you said it does. But we can talk about the academics all day and all night, which is not our purpose today. But you can see how this Kabbalistic idea of Moshiach can easily spill over into something incredibly dangerous. By the way, Sholem's thesis that Hasidut became non-messianic because of this is a little bit kicked into touch by the whole Chabad movement, which clearly reclaimed messianic ideas and put them back into Chabad, which is not for now, but that may be based on the Alter Rebbe as well, and his whole idea of the tzaddik being in some way an emanation of God as well. So you get into all sorts of dangerous ground, which I'm not getting into. However, what we are getting into today is a completely new understanding of Mashiach, which is Mashiach Ben Yosef. And we're going to go into sources that we don't normally get to in this year. The Arizal himself was hailed by his followers as Mashiach Ben Yosef, potentially. Rab Chaim Vital, one of his main students, actually saw himself as potentially Mashiach Ben David, coming after Mashiach Ben Yosef. This was all pre-Shabbetai Zevi. So you can see already there are these underlying potentials for this breaking out, but it was kept under wraps until Shabbetai Zevi. But why is this idea, where does this idea come from, that there are two messiahs? There's one Messiah that will come, that will die, and there's another Messiah that will come after. You can already hear that there are slightly dangerous sounding ideas of dead messiahs coming back to life, etc. We'll get to that when we get there. Where does all this come from? This actually is a much more mainstream idea than you think. And one of the great mysteries, perhaps it's not a mystery, but one of the most striking features is the Rambam never mentions this once. He never mentions Mashiach Ben Yosef, even though Mashiach Ben Yosef is talked about by the Rationalistic Rishonim as well, not just by the Kabbalists. We'll see all of that coming up. So now 45 minutes on Mashiach Ben Yosef, everything that you needed to know in 45 minutes. There's a lot more to know. By the way, everything I mentioned, there are reams of, you can buy Gershom Sholem's 1,000-page biography of Shabbetai Zevi, which you can get online for not very much money. You can sit and read that for the next 3 years and become much more an expert on these things than I am. Number one, back into the Torah. Bilam prophesies about the coming of a Redeemer, and he does it in a two-stage way. Look at source number one. Bilam is taken over by God, and his bracha comes out as follows. Erena v'lo ata, I see it, but not now. Ashurena v'lo karov, I perceive it, but it's not close. I could couple it there. Darach kochav miyakov, a star will come out of Yaakov, of Jacob, and this was Bar Kochba, was called Bar Kochba because of this posuk. His real name was Bar Koziva. V'kam shevet miYisrael, and a rod, a staff will come out from Israel. Machatz Pati Moav, he will smash the Moabites. Karkar kol b'nei Shet, and he will crush all the b'nei Shet. V'haya Edom Yerusha, and Edom will take over the land of Edom. V'haya Yerusha Seir Oivav, and take over the land of his enemy Seir. So this dual format, Erena v'lo ata, Esherena v'lo karov, is picked up on by all of the Meforshim, including the Rambam. Number two. The ideas of Mashiach are in the Torah themselves. And they're in all of the ideas of the Nevi'im. After Parshas Bilam, even in Parshas Bilam, which we call Parshas Balak, there are two messiahs. So you're getting all excited. Ooh, he's going to talk about Mashiach Ben Yosef. No, he's not. The Mashiach Harishon Shehu David The first Mashiach was David HaMelech, She'oshias Yisrael miyad tzareihem, u'b'Mashiach ha'achron she'omid b'nadav, and the second Mashiach, which comes from his family, She'moshiach es Yisrael ba'achron, and will save Israel in the end. Meaning he takes you right to the edge of two messiahs, but he says, I think the two messiahs are David HaMelech and Mashiach. And he puts it into the Pesukim. The first part is David. Asher Karov, Zemelech Mashiach. There are Koichach Miyakov, Zedavid. V'kam Shevi Yisrael, Zemelech Mashiach. Umachaz Pasei Moav, Zedavid. V'karkal Kol Bnei Shei, Zemelech Mashiach. V'hai Edom Yeresha, Zedavid. V'hai Yeresha, Zemelech Mashiach. David and Melech Mashiach. He avoids, he could have spoken about Mashiach Ben Yosef here. This was the perfect moment. The two Mashiachs, he won't do it. He puts it back into Mashiach Ben, David Mashiach Hashem. Why? Because the Rambam is, as I say, restorative, to some degree utopic, in the idea that there will be a utopia, not a completely changed world, but what he is not at all is apocalyptic. He will not become apocalyptic. This idea of a cataclysmic end of history to be followed by a utopic age. The Rambam pulled away from that on every level. But we'll see Mashiach Ben Yosef ultimately is the messianic idea of apocalypse. And we'll get into that right now. We haven't even mentioned the word until just now, but we'll talk about it now. Throughout the Second Temple period, really from the book of Daniel, if you ever look at the book of Daniel in Tanakh is very apocalyptic. There was a whole literature in the Second Temple period which didn't make it into the Tanakh, which is called the Apocrypha, and also the Pseudepigrapha, which are different types of works from that Second Temple period, some in the name of the people who wrote them, some in other names. They never made it into Tanakh for all sorts of reasons. Some of them were just too late, like the book of Maccabees. The book of Maccabees is a perfectly good book. Many of the ideas that we have about Hanukkah that Chazal quote are from Sefer Maccabim. Some of them are not included in Tanakh because they were only preserved in Christian traditions. They've been Christologically tampered with to make them refer back to Jesus in different ways. And some of them were just created by people that we're not sure exactly who they were, whether they have Ruach HaKodesh sufficiently to get into Tanakh. There's obviously a lot more to talk about than I've been able to say then. But if you look at the book of Enoch, of Chanach, of the book of Ezra, Dalad, there's all sorts of extensions to Ezra, other books as well. There's an enormously apocalyptic idea running underneath many of these books. And you can go online and find the Apocrypha and you can read them and you'll see how the apocalyptic themes come out. Also, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we're going to come back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, that even later than many of the books of the Apocrypha, towards the end of the Baisheni, beginning of the post-Churban period, the Dead Sea Scrolls are also extremely apocalyptic. There are the sons of light and the sons of darkness, and the sons of light will be the ones who are victorious over the sons of darkness. So we'll get back to that soon and see where Mashiach Ben Yosef fits in. However, Mashiach Ben Yosef occurs in Chazal in a few quotes, which we'll see now, and is referred to by the Meforshim thousands of times. So this is a mainstream idea. So let's throw ourselves into it. Number 3. Says the Gemara in Sukkah, God showed to Zechariah 4 craftsmen. Says the Gemara, who are these 4 craftsmen? Amar Rav Chana bar Bizna, Amar Rav Shimon Chasida, Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef, Eliyahu, the Kohen Sedek. We're getting into Kohen Sedek now. Rashi says Kohen Sedek is Shem, the son of Noach. Why are they called craftsmen? Rashi, number 4. Charashim, umanim. They're creative, they're craftsmen. Mashiachim, shnehem charashim. Why are the Mashiachs both craftsmen? Lebinyan, Beis HaMikdash, because they have to build the Beis HaMikdash. 2 Mashiachs building the Beis HaMikdash. Now, I'll remind you that last week we said that Rashi has the famous comment that the Beis HaMikdash descends from Shamayim. So put that together with this. Maybe we did last week and said there's the body of the Mikdash, the soul of the Mikdash, etc. But the Mashiachs are going to have to build the Beis HaMikdash. Eliyahu had to build the altar on Har Carmel, and Shem we're not getting into now. But these 4 craftsmen, this idea of the Arba Harashim comes up in a few different sources. Here in the Gemara, next number 5 in the Psikta Rabasi, in the Midrash it says, Ksiv v'yireni Hashem Arba Harashim. Who are they? Eloheim, Eliyahu, Melech HaMashiach, Malchi Tzedek, interesting, and Mashuach Milchama. Who is the Mashuach Milchama? The war Messiah. So in halachic terms, the Meshulach Milchama was the Kohen who was sent to the front with the troops. If you look in the Pesukim there in Dvarim, who would give encouragement, he would to the troops and give them their goals and their focus, etc. That was the Meshulach Milchama. But here it seems to be referring to a war Messiah. There's a war Messiah, which is, we'll see, Mashiach Ben Yosef. Similarly, we're famous with the ideas from the beginning of Shemot, the four Lashonis of Geula. V'hoitzeisi, v'hitzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti. You can feel Pesach coming on already when you start talking about these four Lashonis of Geula with the Arba Koisas, and says the Midrash Haggadah number 6, Keneged Arba Geulas Asid HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lahamid Yisrael Arba Geulim. For the four Geulas in the future, there will be four different Goalim. Four Redeemers, V'Eloheim, Eliyahu, Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef, the Kohen Tzedek. Va'aleihem, who I man about them, it says, you send off the shore and the chamor. Who is the shore and who is the chamor? Midrash Tanchuma number 8. Mashalchi Regel Hashor, Ze Mashiach ben Yosef, Shenil Mshal the shore. Yosef is the shore, the Chor shore. V'zem chamor, who is the donkey? Mashiach ben David, Shenema Ani Rochev al Chamor. He comes like a poor man riding on a donkey. Shor and chamor. Look at the Vilna Gaon in number 9. Hashor Perush Beraya Mehemna. He quotes there from the Zohar. Ze Remez al Mashiach ben Yosef. Sheyichle ha'umois shenikra. The Umas ha'olam will be destroyed by Mashiach ben Yosef because they're called Yerek Hasadeh. The pasuk there from Bilam. Kilachayich Hashor. It's Yerek Hasadeh. That the ox licks up the grass of the field. He quotes there from the Bracha of Yosef, B'chor Shor, firstborn ox, Shor v'chamor. These ideas of Shor v'chamor come up again and again. Another example, fascinating, coming up very soon, Parshas Pekudei, where all of the Kalim in the Beis HaMikdash are anointed. And of course, anointed is the word Mashiach. Okay, that's where it comes from. By the way, there's a fascinating discussion as to whether Mashiach himself will need to be anointed. The word Mashiach means the anointed one, but it may actually be that Mashiach doesn't need anointing, which is ironic and interesting at the same time, but that's not for now. Number 10. Look at the Pesukim. This is the building of the Mishkan. You'll take the oil which is used for anointing. You'll anoint the Mishkan, and everything in it, and make it holy. And all of the vessels will be holy then. You'll give the Mizbech, you'll anoint the Mizbech, and all of the accoutrements for the Mizbech, and you make the Mizbech holy. And it'll be the holy of holies. You will anoint the washing vessel, and the base for it, the Kidashta. So you see, all of the things in the Mishkan had to be anointed separately with oil. Look at what the Targum Yonasan does to this. Fascinating. Number 11. Targum Yonasan is a much more midrashic Targum. Targum Onkelos is very precise, only veers into circumlocution when there is something that seems to describe God's actions or God's, anything anthropomorphic. Then the Targum Onkelos goes off in a different way, but usually it's very straight. But Targum Yonasan is very midrashic. Look what it says here. You will take the anointing oil, the Tarbiyat Mishkana, and you will anoint the Mishkan, V'yat Kol Debei, and everything in it, Kadesh Yatei, and you make it holy. Why? Matul, for the sake of Klil, the Malchasa, the Beis Yehuda, Umalchasa, Umalka Mashiach. This is being done in order for the sake of the crown of Mashiach, the Asid Lemifrak Yat Yisrael B'Soif Yomai, that will one day save Yisrael. Okay, that's that pasuk. But to Rabbi Yad Midbacha, you will anoint the Mizbeach, the altar of the Mizbeach HaOlah. The Yad Kol Manu and all its Kelem, to Kadash, Yat Midbacha, and you'll make it holy. Vayeh Midbacha Kodesh Kedushin. Kodesh Kudshin. Why? What's the Mizbeach? Matul, for the sake of Kalila de Kahunta, the pure Kohen, the Kohen Gadol Aaron, Ubenoi Eliyahu, and his children Eliyahu, Kahana Rabbah, and the Eliyahu, Kohen Gadol, the Atid lemishtalacha b'soif galvasa, that Eliyahu will be sent at the end of days. Next, but to Rabbi Yad Kior v'Yad Vasisa Kadesh Yatei, you will anoint the Kior, Matul, for the sake of, and look who's coming in now, Yoshua, Mishum Shanach, Yoshua, your Shamash, Rabbi the Sanhedrin, the head of the Sanhedrin, which is with his people, the Al Yado, because through Yeshua, Atida Arid Israel is Palyana, his descendants will be responsible for dividing Israel. Who was that? Yeravam ben Nevat. Yeravam, who divided the Jewish people to Israel in the north and Judah in the south. U'Mashiach bar Ephraim, and the Mashiach bar Ephraim, the Nafik Minei, which will come from Yeshua. Who was Yeshua? He's from the tribe of Ephraim. Who was Ephraim? Yosef. Ephraim is Yosef. The Al Yadoi, because through Mashiach ben Yosef, Asidim Beis Yisrael and Menatzcha, the Gog, they will beat Gog, Ulisiate, and all those who are with him, Besoif Yemaya, at the end of days. So this apocalyptic theme of Mashiach ben Yosef coming in through Yeshua here is very much part of the mainstream sources that we've seen. These are not overtly Kabbalistic sources. These are Gemaras, Midrashim, Targumim in the classic way. Now, the most important source of all is number 12. Let's look at number 12, and this will introduce for us some important Rav Kook material that we need to see towards the end of the shir. The Gemara here brings from Zechariah, Bayomahu, Yigdal HaMisped B'Yerushalayim K'Misped Hadad Rimon Bebekat Megidon. There will be a great lamentation, a great eulogy, like the eulogy for Hadad Rimon, which refers to Achav, when Achav died in the battle in Megiddo. There was a eulogy, there will be a great eulogy as big as that. V'savta ha'aretz mishpachot levad, and all of the land will give a hesped, families on each separately. Mishpachot beit David levad, u'nesheim levad, the house of David, the wives of David will be separate to the men and the women separated at the funeral. And by the way, this is the source for separate seating at a wedding. If you think, well, you want to find a source for separate seating, and there has been for the last at least 700 years, a major debate within the Jewish people as to whether you need separate seating at a wedding or you can have mixed seating at a wedding, which we had a whole shir on a while ago, which we're not going to get back to now. But it's learned from this pasuk that if the funeral already was separate, and a funeral is not as light-hearted as a wedding, then a wedding for sure has to be separate. But I'm not getting into that now. So the Gemara asks, hi, Spade my avidity. What's this hesped? Pligi beida Rabbi Yosef Rabban. So Rabbi Yosef and the Rabbanon disagree. Chad Amar, one says, Al Moshiach ben Yosef sheneherag. This hesped is for Moshiach ben Yosef, who is killed in this final battle. For Chad Amar, and the other says, Al Yetzer Hara sheneherag, which we saw last week. This connects it with last week. It's for the Yetzer Hara, which will be slaughtered in the end of days. So the Gemara says, Bishlam alamanda Amar al Moshiach ben Yosef sheneherag. I understand there being a eulogy, a hesped, sadness for Moshiach ben Yosef is killed. Heinrich says, that's why it says, he be to Eli, they will look to me. Et asher dakaru, of those who were slain. For saftu alav, and they will make a hesped of it, k'misped ala yachid, like one would make a hesped for an only child. We'll get back to that soon. The Psukim in Zechariah. And Alamanda Amal Yetzer Hara shenerag hayaspeda ba boilim avid. Why do you need to make a hesped for the Yetzer Hara? Simcha boilim avid. You should make a simcha for the Yetzer Hara that it's gone. What's that?
No.
Oh, good. Okay. So then we get into what we said last week. So why were they crying? And we get the famous midrashic idea that we talked about last week, that God will show the tzaddikim and the Rishaim, the Yetzer Hara, and to the Rishaim it'll look like a tiny hill, and to the tzaddikim it'll look like a big mountain. And the tzaddikim will cry. They'll say, "Oh my goodness, we managed to get through this mountain." And the Rishaim will cry because they say, "How could we not get over this little hill?" That we saw last week. But this is the Gemara where it comes up. But according to the first opinion, is Mashiach ben Yosef. And he's got to die. That's an apocalypse. There's going to be a terrible destruction before Mashiach ben David can come. But it's not as simple as that, is it ever? Look at number 13. There's another pasuk, Yeshaya, V'sara kinas Ephraim, talking about the times of the Messianic era. The jealousy of Ephraim will be removed. But Soirei Yehuda yikaresu, and those who aggravate, who disturb Yehuda will be taken away. Ephraim lo yikaneh et Yehuda, v'Yehuda lo yatzor et Ephraim. Ephraim and Yehuda will eventually be able to reconcile. It says Rashi, Mashiach ben Yosef u'Mashiach ben David lo yikneu ze bazeh. There will come a time when these two Mashiachs are not jealous of each other anymore. Well, 1 second, I thought you just told me Mashiach ben Yosef is going to be dead before Mashiach ben David comes. Sounds like they're both living together in perfect harmony, which of course is classic in the idea of Yehuda and Yosef being the two brothers that are most opposed to each other, which divide the country eventually. and Binyamin, of course, is meant to be the glue that holds them together. Eventually, they will be reconciled. But this sounds like a different type of Mashiach Ben Yosef than the one that I thought about before. So all of this is giving us the ability to actually look at this a little bit more and move on to Rav Kook. I brought you in number 4 just before we get into the later ideas. I brought you just a little bit on the Kabbalah. I'm not, again, please don't take my Kabbalah as anything other than a novice Kabbalah. But in Kabbalistic thought, Moshiach Ben Yosef and Moshiach Ben David are supercharged. Because don't forget, there are different sides of this spherus diagram, this spherus architecture. And the idea there, looking number 14, the Zohar says here, Betrain Mashiachim, these two messiahs, the inhu chad miyamina, one is coming from the right, Moshiach ben David, v'chad mismala, and one is coming from the left, Moshiach ben Yosef. So the Zohar works this whole duality of Mashiach and fits it into this duality of the spiritual reality. Meaning, in the spherus, down the right-hand side of Chachma, Chesed, and Netzach, this is the power of the right, of the masculine, of the male. And on the other side, Bina, Gvura, Hay, these are the powers of the female side, the left-hand side. And a great deal of Kabbalistic Sephirotic thought is put into this merger of the male and the male and the female coming together, which can then create a new life, which is bringing Shefa down to the world through Yesod, through to Malchut, which receives Yesod and Malchut are also part of this male and female bonding. And that creates the, if you like, the offspring, which is the downflow of goodness that comes down from these emanations of God into our world. And when we do Averas, we pull apart the male and female, which is also, if you remember, L'Shem Yichud, when Kabbalistic thinkers say you should say L'Shem Yichud before you do a mitzvah, which of course the Noda Yehuda said, you must not say L'Shem Yichud. But what is L'Shem Yichud? L'Shem Yichud Kud Shebrichu V'Shchinte. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the male aspect of the emanation. Shechina is the female. L'Shem Yichud, what you're trying to do is bring them together. And when you do Averas, you pull them apart. And that cannot then fertilize. And of course, there's a lot of male-female imagery. Chesed is the putting in the seed, and Gvura is building it like a womb, etc. And Moshiach ben Yosef and Moshiach ben David are, I feel like, an ultimate emanation of this idea, which is really, really interesting.
What do you mean with being supercharged?
What did I say was supercharged?
Too much Shekhinah.
Right, because this is the ultimate and final bonding in this world of the male side on the right and the female side on the left, which is able to create the fruit, which is Yemos HaMashiach. They have to come together. Now, I brought you a little bit from Chabad here. This is an article that just expressed it quite well, but we'll see where he's getting this from right now before we get to Rav Kook. Number 15. The essential task of Moshiach ben Yosef is to act as a precursor to Moshiach ben David. He will prepare the world for the coming of the final Redeemer. Different sources attribute to him different functions, some even charging him with tasks traditionally associated with Moshiach ben David, such as ingathering the exiles, building the Beis HaMikdash, and so forth. The principal and final function ascribed to Moshiach ben Yosef is of a political and military nature. He shall wage war against the forces of evil that oppress Israel. More specifically, he will do battle against Edom, the descendants of Esav. Edom is the comprehensive designation of the enemies of Israel and will be crushed through the progeny of Yosef. And I brought you a footnote there that in other versions it's Yishmael, which is the final enemy of the Jewish people, but you can ask different people who have different perspectives on that. The immediate results of this war will be disastrous. Is the apocalypse. Moshiach ben Yosef will be killed. This is described in the prophecy of Zechariah, who says of the tragedy, they shall mourn him as one mourns an only child, which we saw a minute ago. His death will be followed by a period of great calamities. These new tribulations should be the final test for Israel, and shortly thereafter, Moshiach ben David shall come, avenge his death, resurrect him, and inaugurate the messianic era of everlasting peace and bliss. Now, I could have brought you from any number of different summaries. I just brought that because I thought that was concise and helpful. And of course, Chabad do talk a lot about Mashiach, and therefore they have great resources on Mashiach. Interestingly, I don't know if you get into the messianic workings of Chabad, if they felt the Rebbe was Moshiach ben David, or could have been, did they have a candidate for Moshiach ben Yosef, or did they think the Rebbe might have been Moshiach ben Yosef? I don't know enough about Chabad messianism to get into that, but it's worth thinking about. But where are they getting all these ideas from? So we saw already the Gemaras, but let me bring you 4 later sources. First of all, Rav Saadia, number 16. Now, he may be a surprising addition here. Rav Saadia was not a Kabbalist. Rav Saadia was one of the first philosophical, rationalist thinkers writing Emunas V'Deus in the 900s, in the 10th century. And the Rambam very much comes in, he doesn't agree with Rav Sadigan on many things, but he comes in the wake of that rationalist philosophical school. Rav Sadigan, Rabbeinu Bachya ibn Bekuda, the Rambam himself. And therefore, you see here, the Rav Sadigan refers to Moshiach Ben Yosef. It's not just a Kabbalistic idea. Number 16. There are two issues coming together. What does this mean? And here we see the first source on this sheet, anyway, of this important idea. If we don't do tshuva, Ben Yosef, then all of these things, these cataclysmic, apocalyptic ideas of Ben Yosef will happen. But if we do tshuva, then they won't happen. Yiralanu Moshiach ben David. Pitam, Moshiach ben David can come without all of this cataclysm. And if there is a Moshiach ben Yosef, if we do tshuva, then what will he do? He will be a messenger. Shaliach to if you like, to give the good news of Moshiach ben David coming. These are very important words. Tikkun of the nation and Mesakel Haderech. He will pave the way. Moshiach ben Yosef could be cataclysmic and die, but if we do tshuva properly, he doesn't have to be. Moshiach ben Yosef could be the preparation for Moshiach ben David. Look over in number 17. This is the Orach Chaim on Bilam, on the whole parsha there. Darach kochav meyakov v'kam shevet miYisrael. Hakavana bazeki im Yisrael yeh begedesh yeh nikram Yaakov. If the Jewish people can be a Yaakov, lo ya'ir lahem ela Moshiach ben David, then they will only get Moshiach ben David. Because that's Yaakov, they only got Moshiach ben David. Aval Moshiach ben Ephraim yamutz, but the Moshiach ben Yosef, because Moshiach ben Ephraim will have to die. B'milchama rishon, there won't be a bonding between them. She again a Romulus, because Romulus will have to destroy him. Because Amru Chazal, like Chazal said, Aval, im Yisrael yi kulam tzadikim. If we can do tshuva and be tzadikim, shebeshem Yisrael yitkanu, when we can be called Yisrael instead of Yaakov, as afilu oisas shevet shehu Mashiach ben Mashiach haba me'Ephraim, then even the Mashiach ben Yosef from Ephraim, v'kam, he will arise. Meaning what? Not die. Perish tiyeh lo tkuma. They will be established. Lifnei oivav, he will be victorious before his enemies. V'lo yargenu Romulus, he won't be killed. And again, he fits this into the pasuk. Darach kochav miYaakov. There might be a Mashiach coming when we're only a Yaakov. V'kam shevet miYisrael, or there may be a messianic version of that when we do tshuva, when we're acting like a Yisrael. So you see here from the Orach Chaim, the Moshiach ben Yosef and Moshiach ben David could be a dream team if we just get our act together. Last two sources before Rav Kook. Look at number 18. Says Rav Chizdai Kreskas. Chizdai Kreskas was also in the slightly later rationalist philosophical period of Spanish Jewry. He lived in the 1300s. Kreskas, I think, was a Rebbe, the teacher of Rav Yosef Albo. And himself, I think, came from the school of the Ritva. But Kreskas was very much a rationalist. Number 18. He says, no, there are mainstream sources, midrashim, about Mashiach ben Yosef. But he kind of circumvents it a little bit. Some of the Gaonim spoke about this. But because it's really not clear, I don't want to go on about it too much here. And of course, the grand Rebbe of all, the Rambam, never mentions it. So he doesn't want to get into it. However, if you're a Kabbalist, Moshiach ben Yosef is gold. You do want to get into it. And I wanted this last source, 19, from before the Rav Kook, is the Ramchal. What does the Ramchal say? Ki Moshiach ben Yosef. The Ramchal is already a few hundred years later in the 1700s, very much a Kabbalist. You should know the Ramchal in his early life, even throughout his life, was very much suspected as being another Shabbetai Zevi potential. And they confiscated his works, they burnt them, they exiled him. If you could have guessed during the life of the Ramchal, what will people think of the Ramchal 300 years from now? You could never have guessed that the Ramchal would be such a mainstream figure. He was really suspected during his life of being a dangerous Kabbalist. And when you read about his Bet Midrash, when he was still a teenager, they were having 24/7 Zohar learning. all around the clock in Mishmarot, and it talks about him learning who are his chavrusas, his talmidim say. He used to learn with Moshiach, he used to learn with Adam HaRishon, he used to learn with Moshe Rabbeinu. These are good chavrusas if you can get them. Yeah, but you can see why people felt this was like, oh my goodness, well, here we are all over again. So, but the Ramchal was very much rehabilitated in the Litvish world by the Vilna Gaon, who came 50, 60 years later, who said, I would have crawled on my hands and knees to learn at his feet if I could have just done that. By the Hasidim that saw him as a proto-Hasidus figure. Lots of Hasidus is built on Ramchal's ideas. And by the Haskalah, who saw him as one of the original founders of modern-day Jewish culture. He wrote plays, he wrote theater, he spoke Hebrew, he wrote Hebrew. Of course, he didn't write theater in order to perform in Tel Aviv in the Yiddish Theater Company. But nevertheless, everyone loves the Ramchal now. Look what the Ramchal writes. Number 90. Ki Moshiach Ben Yosef hu besod hasmol. Well, we know what that means now. We've just seen the Zohar. Moshiach Ben Yosef is coming from the left, from the feminine side. V'hu besod hachitzoniyut. He is the external. Hatzarich l'kol hatikunim haile. And you need him for tikkun. These words that we've been talking about, he needs to be mataken. Mashiach ben David, he besod hayamin. Mashiach ben David is coming from the male side, from the right. Mitchaber elav, and he has to join together, and then ha'geula shalema. We will have geula shalema. Just before we go to Rav Kook and talk about geula shalema, I just want to refer you to the appendix just for a second. If you look on page 7, I brought you I'm sorry that the copy came out quite dark, but on the left there is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you're interested in me sending you a color version of this afterwards, send me an email and I'll send it to the original. This is a little scroll, just one page, which has like a torn off bit on the bottom right, called the Testimonia. And I wrote you a little, give you a little bit of this on the right-hand side, which is seen by many academics as being one of the earliest references to this idea of a Yehoshua Ben Yosef messianic war figure. Because some of the academics took the view that Moshiach Ben Yosef as a concept was developed after Bar Kokhba died, because they needed to try and justify how could he have died, how can that be? We thought he was the Messiah, and therefore they created this whole Moshiach Ben Yosef. But this particular academic says, no, that's completely wrong. Moshiach Ben Yosef is much older than Bar Kokhba. This scroll was written in the 100 years prior to the Churban, and already talks about these 4 craftsmen, and there's a graph at the bottom here, a little chart, comparing both this extract from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Testimonia, together with the Gemara in Sukkah of the Arba Charoshim, together with the Targum Yonis that we looked at. And you can read that, and I brought you references to how to get a hold of the article if you're interested. But this is potentially a very, very old concept, this Moshiach Ben Yosef. However, it's also a very new one, because now let's go to Rav Kook. Rav Kook arrived in Jaffa. He got off the boat on May the 13th, Friday, May the 13th. I don't think he was too worried about Friday the 13th. But it actually was the 28th of Iyar when he arrived first in Eretz Israel, which would, of course, 60 years later become the Yom Yerushalayim, 63 years later. But he got off the boat in ER 1904 as the chief rabbi of the city. Obviously, Rav Kook, many people had great expectations and great concerns when Rav Kook arrived, because to the right, to the old Yishuv, what would become, if you like, the Haredi world, he was seen as a very suspicious character. He was a little bit unpredictable, quite unusual. He spoke Hebrew. He was a Kabbalist. I'm saying he spoke Hebrew. Nobody spoke Hebrew then. In yeshiva, he would speak Hebrew. In Volozhin, which was very strange. In Volozhin, he had a beard. Nobody had a beard then before they were married. Now every shnip has a beard. Everyone has a beard. But in those days, only the Rosh Yeshiva had a beard. So he had a beard. And there's an account that he used to look down when he was learning in Volozhin as a bacher. He used to look down under the stender every now and then and look up again. And the bacherim in Volozhin was a pretty Labadic place. They said that they went to report him to the Netziv, Rosh Yeshiva. They said he's looking at newspapers. The equivalent of checking your emails in the Bet Midrash. He's looking at newspapers. He's like not to be trusted. And the Netziv wouldn't hear of it. And he said, you don't speak Lashon Hara. He's the best student in the yeshiva. Anyway, he kept them locked up. So they broke into his stender and they saw what he was looking at. What was he looking at? He had Kabbalistic names of God written on parchment that he was looking at to get like kavanas as he was learning the Gemara. Not quite the newspaper. Okay, fine. So Rav Kook was an unusual person.
Not necessarily Much better.
Right, in Volozhin terms, yes. I'm not sure that they would have been too excited by that. Correct. And of course, he had Zionistic leanings, which was very nerve-wracking to the old Yishuv. Now, the new Yishuv saw him as part of the problem as well, because he's a rabbi, another rabbi. They said there's another rabbi with a big furry hat to tell us what we do and what we shouldn't do. And we don't want more rabbis, so everyone saw him as the other side. And of course, he wanted to keep a low profile. A new rabbi, relatively young, but 4 or 5 weeks after he arrived, Theodor Herzl dropped dead. And they said to him, you have to give a hesped. He wasn't only the rabbi of Jaffa, he was also the rabbi of the Moshavot, of all the new settlements all around Israel, many of which were secular. And they said, okay, now you can do what a rabbi is meant to do. Give a hesped for Theodor Herzl. And of course, he's got a problem, because the Shulchan Aruch says you're not allowed to give a hesped to somebody who is, anti-religious, who's non-religious. He eats treifas and he doesn't keep Shabbos, doesn't keep Yom Kippur. Shulchan Aruch paskins that you have to make merry, drink wine, and celebrate when these people die. So what's he going to do? He's really caught on the horns of a dilemma. So he decided to give a non-eulogy, to speak about something else, and only obliquely reference Theodor Herzl. But this non-eulogy became one of the most important statements of religious Zionism, setting up this for the next 150 years or whatever. And he talks about Moshiach Ben Yosef. Let's have a look at what he says. This is only an extract from the eulogy. You can get the whole thing in English on the link that I gave you in the footnotes. Number 20, the Lamentation in Jerusalem. Richard's in Hebrew, of course, absolutely, beautiful Hebrew. On that day, he quotes from Zechariah, the Lamentation will be great in Jerusalem, like the Lamentation of Hadad Rimon in the valley of Megiddo. We saw that possible. So it came about, says Rav Kook, that throughout the exile, there is a seesaw effect of these two opposing forces. At times, there is exhibited a drive towards material worldly success that flows primarily from the foundation of Yosef and Ephraim. And at other times, there is a stirring of a spiritual drive for observance of Torah and spiritual development for awe and the love of God. So the first thing he does is he sets up Moshiach Ben Yosef, Moshiach Ben David, not just as two Moshiachs, but two themes of the Jewish people throughout Jewish history. There's one theme, which is that the Jews are successful and they make money and they're universalistic and they go out in the world, like Yosef, Hamashbir, who is living in Egypt with an Egyptian name, Safnat Panech, and an Egyptian wife and a big chariot and a big house in Memphis, Egypt, not Memphis, okay? And he is the provider. But then there's Yehuda. Yehuda is the yeshiva bocher, has to build the ghetto walls, has to detach from the outside world, is focused inwards, learning Torah. So these two themes have been constantly going through the Jewish people. Second paragraph. Since it's impossible for our nation to attain its lofty destiny other than by actualizing these two components, the universal symbolized by Yosef and the distinctive symbolized by Yehuda, there arise in the nation proponents of each aspect. Those who would enhance spirituality prepare the way for Moshiach ben David, whose focus is the final destiny. And truly, the focus of life is spiritual attainment, except that the spiritual can only develop properly if it's accompanied by all the material acquisitions of which a full-bodied nation is in need. Those who redress the material general aspects of life prepare the way for Moshiach ben Yosef. You maybe can begin to see where he's going here. He's saying, if you are Moshiach, Moshiach can't arrive in a desolate, broken down desert land of Palestine. Mashiach needs to come to a place with high tech and with an army and with a navy and with roads and infrastructure and bridges and trains and That's Mashiach ben Yosef. When these two forces work at cross purposes as a result of the calamity of exile, short-sightedness and disarray, these are the birth pangs of Mashiach, or more to be exact, the birth pangs of messiahs, plural. In Tehillim, he writes that your enemies have defied, O Lord, those who have defied the footsteps of your messiahs, ikvok Mashiachecha, plural messiahs, two footsteps of two messiahs. And here again, he says the calamity, the cataclysm before Mashiach is these two forces within the Jewish people working against each other. The secular universal force rejecting the religious, and the religious rejecting the secular. That's the birth pangs of Mashiach. Now, since the major achievement of Moshiach ben Yosef, which is the general advancement of mankind, is accomplished by de-emphasis of the unique Jewish form, Moshiach ben Yosef cannot endure, so he's destined to be killed. Not a person. The secular idea of building the land will go through a process which will one day come to an end, when the people in that world will realize that We were just preparing the way for a bigger picture, and therefore Moshiach Ben Yosef dying means the tshuva revolution of the secular Israeli world. When this happens, all will recognize the perversity of the situation. They'll realize that it was wrong not to subjugate the universal dimension to the spiritual aspect, which is Israel's destiny, to the kingdom of David. They will lament him as one laments an only son and grieve for him as one grieves for a firstborn son, says Zechariah. Now, the lamentation for an only child is bereft of hope for future children. Elderly parents who've lost their only son, Rahman al-Islam, are totally forlorn. If the verse were to end on that note, it would spell utter doom. But the bitterness is mitigated by intellect. Intellect perceives that the nation has produced the souls of the messiahs. The nation is not as elderly parents who've lost their only child, but rather as young parents who've lost their firstborn child. Both of those mashalim are given in Zechariah. Being inexperienced at raising children, they did not attend properly to the child in a state of illness, so the child succumbed. But it's not the end. They can have more children. They can go on. By the same token, the nation comes to the realization that it did not know how to make proper use of this universalist dimension. It did not understand how it could contribute to Israel's unique destiny. In that way, it could have survived. The nation labored under the illusion brought on by the divisiveness of exile, that these two forces are truly at odds. The result is, and here's why Rav Kook falls out with everybody, that whoever holds up the universal side of this nation becomes, unfortunately, an enemy of Torah and mitzvahs, meaning the secular yeshuv, which is focusing on the kibbutzim and growing the land, is an enemy of Torah, who will one day all do tshuva. But what about the old yeshuv sitting in yeshiva? Contrary-wise, whoever focuses on the uniquely Jewish becomes an adversary of material well-being. You can't get a job. You're not allowed to work. You have to sit in kollel your whole life. You have to be poor. In the first scenario, the fence of Torah is broken down. The secular Jews break down Torah. In the second, the result is weakness and morosity. Sitting in yeshiva, you're all weak and sad, learning all day. And you guys are all breaking down the Torah, working in high tech. Now, again, there's no better way to upset everybody than to do this. But of course, what he wants to do is he wants to build a bridge. Fine. After this latest experience of Messiah Ben Yosef's impermanence, let us deduce that truly the two forces are not mutually antagonistic. It is time to bring it all together, to organize the nation's ways. Let every universal perfection serve as a basis for perfecting uniquely Israelite. Let both parties, those disposed to the material and the universal, those disposed to the spiritual and the particularistic, come to the same conclusions. Because don't forget, the secular Jews at that time said, we are the last generation of Jews and the first generation of Hebrews. We are losing all that old Jew. We are going back to a Canaanite culture, almost. I remember Shimon Peres used to talk about making Israel the Hong Kong of the Middle East. Okay, so Hong Kong's not so great right now, so that may be not something that he envisaged, but at the time, it sounded like a very good secular idea, but not what Rav Kook's talking about. Then the lamentation will be on both sides. Both will recognize their mistake. The two forces were created to be united. Yosef and Yehuda, once rent asunder, they were mutually injurious. Now to Zionism. The Zionist vision manifest in our generation might be symbolized as the footsteps of Moshiach Ben Yosef. Ikva de Moshiach Ben Yosef. Zionism tends to universalism, as opposed to Jewish particularism. It is unequipped to realize that the development of Israel's general aspects is just the foundation for Israel's singularity. The leadership of the Zionist movement must be greatly influenced by the gifted few of the generations, the righteous and the sages of Israel. He's telling the secular Zionists, you've got to go to Jerusalem and start asking shilos. You've got to connect with the Gedolei Hador in the Haredi world. On the other hand, the ideal of Israel's national renaissance, including all the material accoutrement, which is a proper thing when joined to the spiritual goal, today does not succeed. Lack of success has brought infighting until finally the leader of the movement has fallen, a victim of frustration. This in 1904, just to give you an insight, the Mizrahi movement, the religious Zionists, had left the Zionist Congress because they felt they'd been effectively kicked out. Founded Mizrahi as a movement, which really never connected with Rav Kook completely either. And therefore, there was a lot of infighting. And he said, you look around you. Israel in 1904 has not yet become the place it needs to be. One wonders if Rav Kook could get off a plane now and walk around Israel today, whether he would feel that this was prophetic beyond words. It behooves us to take heart to try and unify the tree of Joseph and the tree of Yehuda, to rejoice in the national reawakening and to know that this is not the end goal of Israel, but only a preparation. And in the last paragraph, he talks about tshuva, national tshuva, etc., etc. Now, of course, people turned around to Rav Kook and said, excuse me, you just called Theodor Herzl Moshiach Ben Yosef. To which the answer is, no, he didn't. He called the secular Zionist movement Moshiach Ben Yosef, which may actually be no better from other people's perspectives. But he uses the Moshiach Ben Yosef idea and translates that as the modern Israeli state. In that sense, as Moshiach Ben Yosef, the Israeli state is Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, the beginning of a process of Geula. And like the Ramchal said, when Moshiach Ben Yosef joins with Moshiach Ben David, then you have Geula Shalema. So all the phrase Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, for all of the controversy that makes and causes, is really a restatement of Rav Kook, that this is one part of a Geula, the Moshiach Ben Yosef Geula. Very interesting ideas, I think, and very practical and very relevant to us today. Next week, part 4, the final part, we will get to Techias HaMesim, and we will look at one of the major controversies that actually got the Rambam in his own lifetime. After the Rambam died, there was a massive controversial rejection of the Rambam's work, but during his life, he was pretty much untouchable. But on this issue, they did criticize him, and we'll see what he said, and we'll see what he means, and we'll finish with that next week. And we'll maybe get on to a little bit of human cloning, if we feel like it, and we'll finish and we'll move on to something else. Okay, thank you very much.